Welcome to Live from Plato's Cave. I am Mario Veen. This is episode 26, Dealing with Collapse with Chris Julien. I spoke about the idea of Socrates as an activist before, in episode 24 with Hannah Prince. Socrates challenged the authorities of his day. And in Plato's allegory of the cave, we can imagine how the returning soul must feel. His old buddies are still watching the shadows. He tries to shake them up, to make clear that the shadows on the wall are not the whole picture. But they are under the impression that they already have everything in the picture that matters. So they don't respond. So how do you deal with the message of scientists that we have to take radical action to avoid tipping points in our climate system and ecological system? While on the other hand, you see that the adults in the room, that are responding with classical psychological mechanisms such as denial, killing the messenger, and hoping for a miracle that makes all the problems go away. Our guide today through Plato's Cave is Chris Julien. Chris has a deep interdisciplinary insight into the climate crisis. He mixes research and practice in the fields of public innovation, theory and culture, with a focus on ecology and epistemology. He is currently pursuing a PhD at Utrecht University that combines new materialisms and eco-thinking to constitute a field of ecological governance. He is also active in Extinction Rebellion and XR Nieuwsmedia. And he works on urban ecology and artistic research projects with Waag Futurelab. Chris holds cum laude master's degrees in conflict studies and human rights and in cultural analysis. I talked to your Extinction Rebellion colleague Hannah Prince this afternoon. And for me it was a difficult conversation, just because I think that's also what climate activism does, is it confronts you with a reality that you rather not think about. So one thing I was thinking about on the way back is that there's a point if you start to learn about the climate, the state of our planet, you start to learn about the science a little bit, there emotion comes into play. So frustration, anger, depression, everything like that. So I think there's like an emotional component that people have to go through when they learn about the science. And I was just wondering, do you see it that way as well? And did you have something like that in your life?
Yeah. Well, that's really cutting to the core of it, I think, when it comes to activism now and climate change. Yeah, emotion is the core. Both in terms of the challenge I think we face now with climate activism is how to get people to emotionally on board all this information and find a place in their everyday life, which is of course also an emotional life, to sort of maybe not hold on to all the data points and all the dynamics, which are far too complex, but just the existential sense of being in a planet, being on a planet that is changing really rapidly and dangerously. That's a really big thing to realize when you didn't grow up with that sense. So I think as a climate movement also we've come to understand the importance of that element, not only for ourselves. I think it was always for me also really great to become part of a group of people that really allows the emotion in without immediately feeling like it's sort of cliche or a bit silly or kind of being a bit nervous or laughy about talking about emotions. It's not something we're used to doing outside of sort of the therapist's room, maybe. So, but that conversation that we were already having within sort of activist circles or within people that have already stepped into that space, that existential space of the world is in crisis. That's something that has to open up to the rest of the world, and to do so without as Timothy Morton said recently when I spoke to him, without this PTSD inducing, way of dealing with all the information, because constantly repeating all these facts about climate change, as you said, induces all these emotions, but it's also quite traumatic. So to not only as activists, but really as society, to understand that we are together in a traumatic state and that we have to also be careful with each other and for each other in that space, I think is really, really important. For me, I've often wondered how that works. I'm a child of two psychologists, so I have many.
So you had a head start.
Yeah, I had a head start. They were quite. They did that quite well. They worked quite well with the fact that they were a psychotherapist, and not to bring that, let's say, to the dinner table, but you did get like a free education in psychology and how defense mechanisms in particular work, how people can push away things that they on some level know, but then on another level don't digest. So I didn't have necessarily this existential crisis moment, this breach, but more just something that lingered for a long time. And I tried to give it a role in my life in all these different ways. And then when Extinction Rebellion came along, I remember this big banner on the bridge that said climate change, we're fucked. And then the people were blocking the bridge. And for me, that was really a relief. I was like, that's what we should be doing, cutting through the politeness and the hopeful bedtime stories for children. It's all going to be fine. We're going to have brilliant technology, or our leaders are going to solve this for us. But really just saying it like it is, being really a bit brutally honest about it, and then taking action in the energy that honesty, I think, brings. So for me, there wasn't a big break like we're fucked, but there was a big break like we can actually say that we're fucked and take it from there.
I guess that's also part of the trauma, that on the one hand, you get this message, this realization that there's something big going on that we can make sense of, and it doesn't seem like the how do you say that? The people in charge in the room. What's the term for that?
The adults in the room.
The adults in the room. Our politicians are where we buy our food and everything. They're not even acknowledging it. But the moment that you speak out about it, you're silenced, or you're seen as extreme. But actually, you're just saying, well, actually, I've read this scientific report and this is what it said.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. And it's interesting in that sense. Being an activist is not like a calling for a select group or something. It's just a way of being a citizen that everybody can sort of do. And with XR, you practice it because it's quite, civil disobedience is a bit more rigorous, or a bit more creates a bit more confrontation, a bit more dynamics, because people can be against it, right? So there's more opinions surrounding you about it, and you can carry that into your work. And what I found really interesting is how in every context it will bring up different kinds of rationally coded but quite psychological responses, like, I have to be objective or neutral, or I don't think we should go into apocalyptic discussions, but if we don't have hope, aren't we by definition then hopeless? So there's all these different ways of rationalizing basically that trauma, that you kind of, from that activistic perspective, there's a dissonance that emerges from the encounter that people have with you as an activist and the debates that come. And like with the soup being thrown at artworks, I think that was really the most concentrated form of this dissonance happening. They really managed to grasp that whole emotional confrontation in one act, which I think was quite brilliant, but also taught me again more about what's happening there with this emotional encounter with facts.
Mm-hmm. And it's just crazy to think that throwing soup as a painting in our society is a defense of science, and what you say, a confrontation with facts.
Yeah.
Whereas in any other context, it would be just like, quite inadmissible, I think.
Yeah. I mean, there's this nice term from communications, psychology, a pluralistic ignorance, which means that people don't want to raise an issue because they think other people don't want to talk about it or don't agree with them, or that somehow raising the issue will be problematic, and then they don't raise it. And then everybody has that same position where everybody thinks, I can't raise this issue. And then you get this situation of pluralistic ignorance where something is not dealt with or spoken about. And I think, yeah, that's what we see happening. And that's what the soup was thrown at, actually, was this situation where everybody is able in all their own different ways not to really talk about it, not to really encounter the existential level of the crisis that we're in. So that we have many crises, especially in the Netherlands. I think this is this neoliberal sort of coding of crisis management where every problem becomes a crisis.
Except the climate crisis, as your colleague Hannah points out over and over again.
Yeah.
It's like the housing crisis, the corona crisis, and this crisis and that crisis, climate change.
Exactly. And I think if you look at that through a psychological lens, it's so clear what's going on there, right? It's too big, it's too heavy. So we want to maintain you could almost call it, with like Bertolt Brecht, with sort of like the fourth wall. We want it to stay a television show. We don't want to be in the burning house. We want to be looking at the film about the burning house and have that distance from it because it's just too much to let it all in.
Yeah, so, okay, like a distance, it only happens in Pakistan, or it only happens, in the far future.
Exactly. I mean, this was the geopolitical, like if you speak to it in terms of cognitive dissonance or psychological defense mechanism, you could say that 2050 is like the geopolitical equivalent of a defense mechanism. It's just pushing it out of your life, out of the present, and out of that space where you really have to do something about it because it's so big and urgent.
Mm-hmm.
And that's I think also, maybe Hannah also spoke about that, but a lot of activists will tell you that it's a big relief to step into, so to speak, that space of activism, because it exactly allows you to step into that existential space. Like, yes, this is a problem, and there's a certain honesty in that. That's also really a relief.
Yeah. So, well, that's a great answer to that question about how to deal with, because if you learn about the scientific state of things at this moment, then anger is a very healthy response, I think.
Yeah.
And not to feel anger is an unhealthy response. Or, well, maybe not like that, but it's a natural response to feel angry, right? And the fact is, okay, what can you do when you're angry? And if you're an activist, at least you can do something.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's also the question of like, what group therapy do you want? You want like really pissed off people with fireworks, like blocking protesters with cars, like we saw in Staphorst a couple of days ago, or do you want sort of these like climate activistic modes of group therapy where you deal with problems in a non-violent and caring way? So this is the way I look at these different kinds of group manifestations now, as different forms of dealing with emotions. And I mean, anger is a part of Extinction Rebellion and climate activists, of course, as much as it is of, let's say, more xenophobic or I mean, let's try not to stick too many labels on them, but both, xenophobic and other types of farmers' protests and stuff. But the anger gets channeled in a really different way. My problem there is, especially when you see a lot of climate psychology and climate communications, a lot of attention is paid to despair, depression, hopelessness, helplessness, these kinds of emotions, which are all really also present. But anger is often still slightly taboo because it's, of course, also like an antisocial emotion in a sense. It's a societally threatening emotion. So it's harder to talk about anger in ways that don't immediately sort of lead to extremist or societally rupturing or violent manifestations. So you won't hear a lot of people saying that it's good for kids to be angry about climate change. Whereas I think, it's really healthy, but as a society, we don't manage, I think, yet to talk about anger in a way that's not immediately also associated with violence or transgression, but can actually be healing and be held within a non-violent space.
I heard stories about how children respond to when they learn about the climate conference. What are they talking about and everything? They learn about it a little bit, they get explained it in their language, and then they get angry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you're not angry, you're not paying attention, right?
Yeah. So how do you look at Plato's allegory?
I thought about it a lot since you told me about your concept, because there's so much in there. Of course, as you know and have explored in all your shows. I work a lot in relation to modernity, as let's say the last 500 years, first of all as an intellectual and scientific history, but then also, of course, as a political history, let's say. And then somehow Plato's cave seems to be the prototype, right, of that history. And of course, the Renaissance is this rediscovery of the ancients, of the Greeks, where the Greeks are also somehow an origin story. Somehow the moment that something came out of nothing, and then the
birth
cave
of
is
civilization,
the birth of civilization. Yeah, out of prehistory, out of a non-conscious sort of like non-Hegelian, like mucking about in nature and telling each other myths about trees being conscious and stuff. And Plato's cave seems to be the perfect site to talk about that, because it's this first time. I don't know if it's historically the first time, but it's famously the first time that this image gets positioned between a real world that is no longer real, and then an unreal world that becomes real, the world of the ideas. But in particular, for me, with this cheeky third person, somehow outside of these two positions, describing them and not really explaining themselves where they are.
You mean like the person who tells about, Socrates, in this case, who's explaining, imagine people in a cave and this happens and this happens. But where is Socrates when he's telling that? Yeah.
Where are you in your story? And that's, for me, in my thinking, is always like the main thread, is always this question. For me, that's the big question of the environment, is always, where is the environment of the one telling the story? How do you situate yourself in the environment that you're describing? Instead of this idea with Plato of being able to project onto a wall images, which don't have anything to do with you, the question of, where does the story emerge from, and how does the story emerge? And I was flashing this book at you just before we started, from Havelock, this philologist, this scholar of the ancients of Greek history, who wrote this book, Preface to Plato, about Plato's thinking, but not as this origin story, but rather as a inherent historical continuity with the oral history that came, let's say, before the Platonic tradition. And what I love about that, he writes it almost at the same time that Foucault wrote his Archaeology of Knowledge, so end of the 60s. And it's really brilliant to read somebody not talking about Plato as the starting point of metaphysics and how we sort of discovered rationality and abstract thinking, but as an actor in a society that was changing from an oral power structure where hierarchy and knowledge was transferred through an oral apparatus, where certain ways of speaking, certain ways of remembering were used to have, as he calls it, a book of a culture. So like the technology by which you hold together your way of thinking and speaking. And he was reinventing with a whole group of people this, but against the old power structures, against the authority of the spoken word and the act of speaking that made politics possible in the, let's say, pre-Socratic Greek society. So in that sense, he really shows how Plato didn't necessarily first of all, that he didn't invent it on his own as an act of singular genius, but was a product of his environment, was a product of his times. And if you look at his work in that way, and he does this in this whole book, you suddenly see that the way he's positioning himself and the way he's positioning his thought is not of itself, but is rather really like you can really set it against his political opponents, another mode of education system that was still being worked with in his age, and he was proposing with the academy, of course, a very different way of working, a different way of using language, of thinking. And for me, that really just shows, two things. On the one hand, this habit that we learned with Plato of having this sort of self-enclosed system, with the conceptual being more real than the practical, whereas in the oral histories before that, you always started with the practical, and then you drew your lessons, or your laws were always a consequence of the narrative story, of the real story that was happening to people in a mythical age.
So just to make sure that I understand that part, so the conceptual being more real than the practical, do you mean that because Plato's message of the allegory would be that the practical, the things that we see around us are just the shadows on the wall, but they're actually a conceptual part, and that conceptual part is actually more real than what we see.
Exactly. Yeah. And if you think about his situation, where you have these oral histories, these Homeric stories, which were also ways of conveying knowledge, how to do things, how to speak to a king, how to wage a war, how to be a leader,
how to make it in the world.
How to make it in the world, but also how to conduct oneself in the society one is a part of, right? Essentially, crucially. And so for Plato said, like, the way Homer and the way our society is telling our kids how to behave with these stories, that's just shadows on the walls. That's kind of like bullshit, right? It's all about these higher forms of knowledge, these abstract forms of knowledge, which are possible in a society that is transferring oral knowledge to written knowledge, where of course you can be much more abstract, you can use words in different ways, you can make different kinds of logical sequences. So it was kind of a coup, a changing of the episteme that he was part of, but that also, I think, puts this whole idea about metaphysics on a really different position, because it is no longer somehow something that we are grasping of a higher law, but it is rather, like a political ecology. It is a knowledge that is always captured in a politics, in an environment from which it emerges. And for me, this is a nice prehistory to modernity. This cave and this battle for what is true and who is able to speak. That sort of, if you look at the Cartesian space, for me, would almost also be this kind of garden, this new story with the same kind of premises, where you say, like, the world that we know and that is available to everybody in everyday experience is something we have to kind of get rid of, and we replace that with this structured, logical, rational order, which is abstract, and then we start thinking from that space, and we start to assign everybody roles from that space. As Plato said, the idea of the horse is actually more real than all the horses we see running around. And in modernity, it is still kind of the case that the laws of nature, from Newton to a lot of population biologists and ecologists still working today, will always be this mechanic rules that are more real than the phenomena we are seeing. And then if we look around us and see how the world is responding to this way of working with it, putting the rules first and then the consequences later, it's turning into a really big mess. So for me, this is let's say, trying to understand the history of how we got into this mess where we are constantly destroying the environment, and then trying to understand, like, at what points in our intellectual history did we make these big shifts from taking the environment as our starting point to taking our own logic as a starting point, and then only allowing the environment in to the extent that it fits our rules and our conceptual understanding of the world.
Yeah, when you put it that way, it reminds me of something that Marcia Björnerud, a geologist, I spoke to her before in the podcast, but the first time I spoke to her was also about her book Timefulness. Do you know it by any chance?
No, but sounds good.
It's a great short book about, timefulness is like an awareness of time. And one of the reasons she says we are in this mess is because we are not timeful. We're not aware of the time scale of the planet that we live on. And in the beginning, one of the what she's describing is how geology evolved, but how at one point this was hindered because it was I don't know the exact period, but it was in a period where the physical sciences, so physics, was just the showing everything, was just the master and showing we can calculate this, we can calculate that, and the geologists were looking at the complexity and the stones and the feedback mechanisms and let's say the practical reality in that sense. And there were some, I would say, the physicist who discovered some of these great laws about, for instance, thermodynamics and everything, also applied this to the planet and was dismissing ideas from geology like that are now commonplace. But I think one of the things she says is that this also had to do with the Platonic forms, with the ideas that there are laws of nature, and once we have grasped these laws of nature, we can explain everything. And if something happens that doesn't fit the law of nature, that's not the fault of the law. That's we have to find another way to do that. The problem, however, is that it requires you to be the person that Plato speaks about, which got out of the cave, was able to see the truth, and then return into the cave.
Return into the cave. And then, of course, the question is, like, what is this cave, right? So what's outside of the cave would actually be my better question, rather than the transcendental higher objects, maybe the rest of the world, so to speak. And what I found really striking about that encounter of Plato with the, let's say, pre-Socratic Greek culture, politics, the way society was organized, the way knowledge functioned within society, is that it reminds me a lot of also the encounter, let's say, of us moderns with indigenous cultures, because it's actually more or less the same kind of confrontation between a knowledge system that accepts that there are other knowledge systems in the world, and that performs its own knowledge system consciously in its myths and its traditions and its gestures of culture, and the one that somehow wants to forget that it is also a myth or a culture, and that wants to reach beyond that, let's say, performative way of understanding the world and building a cosmology, having a cosmos with coordinates within which you function, where, what I think in particular geology also still tries to do is try to find this third point, this position outside of the system, and then be able to see the whole system. And it has been critiqued also a lot, especially from decolonial perspectives, right? This idea that geology and the whole geologic, the logic of the planet as this thing that you can know per se, was also a way for colonial powers to legitimize their own conquest of the earth and the exploitation of resources as these geological phenomena that are inanimate and basically resources. So I find it interesting that we are come now to a point in our history where maybe like in 1600 something, we reproduced this Greek gesture of clearing out all the environment and saying, no, there's beyond the environment, there's these rules and laws that drive the mechanism, like this clock. And we now understand that we only see the clock, but actually it's a machine with maybe God somewhere building the clock, making the machine. And I come now to a point, especially with climate crisis, where we see that whole way of looking at the world, there's always something outside of it that we're missing and that can bite you in the ass, and is doing so with us at this huge scale. So when it comes to, like looking at the world from a geological lens, I think there's, of course, all these debates about the Anthropocene and all these scenes.
What is the age that we're living in? What is the geological age that we're living in?
Yeah, and everybody's is playing with that idea. With you can say, oh, it's the Capitalocene, so it's about capitalism, or it's the Eurocene, it's about European conquest of the world. And there's all these beautiful terms. The Plantationocene, I think, is a really good one, saying that it's the logic of the plantation, of monoculture, that has taken over the world, and that even AI and robotics is actually a continuation of that logic of using slave labor to exploit the land. But yeah, my question with all these geologics, all these ways of seeing the planet, would still be like, are you not again making a Plato's cave? Are you not again making a closed system, which has to somehow completely be explained by your rules or your logic that you're bringing in? So for me, the geology is a really interesting one, because it's also a backdoor for these totalizing systems that think they find all the rules and then are able to close. But then once you're closed, you forget that there's always more. And yeah, for me, that would be the simplest way to explain the climate crisis, is that the dominant planetary culture is a European Western culture that has this really deeply rooted tradition and habit of wanting closed systems, feeling only that you're there, or you've achieved it, or it makes sense when it's closed.
So a closed system is like we know everything that we need to know. For instance, there's always a point when some scientific findings, IPCC reports, do come through to politics, and then they comment on it. And then usually the comment is, well, maybe we have to ask some technology people if they can invent a technology that will solve the climate crisis. And I think there are even some efforts already about geoengineering.
Yeah.
Which no geologist or climate scientist will ever say is the answer. But is that what you mean? It's like a way of thinking, like, oh, we just calculate everything, and then we put some rain there, and we put some chemicals there, and then we can geoengineer our way out of it. We can fix our way out of it.
Yeah, it's. I think there's a couple of layers you could describe. Like, I would say that it's this idea of full understanding. Like Newton with his physics kind of proposed us that now we have the laws, we have these formulas, and then we can understand everything.
If you know all the laws and all the initial positions, then you can calculate the rest of time.
Then the whole world runs like clockwork, basically, because all the things are in the right place. Now, that's of course also a very monotheistic way of thinking. And Newton was really religious and also an alchemist, but really a spiritual person with deep faith in God. So for him, of course, force was like the basis of his mathematics, but that was in itself not explained. So force was basically for him unproblematic, because obviously that was God, pushing the whole clockwork forward. So in that story, in the Cartesian story, in the story of geoengineering, there's always this assumption that we can know the whole thing and then we can control it. And then we crafty humans can invent all this kind of stuff. And then the Republic will be perfect. Everything will be in its right place. And there will be no more fear of the environment or of like a tiger, biting your leg off, you'll be safe and comfortable. So it's to come back to the beginning of our conversation. I think it's the same type of psychology that people are not able to bring on board the existential character of the climate crisis is the same kind of sense of wanting to keep a total, complete understanding, keeping total control of the situation and not allowing in fundamental uncertainty and therefore fundamental openness. So I think you can talk about it, historically or psychologically or more scientifically. But it's always about this question of openness and totality, I think. And yeah, geoengineering is like the biggest band-aid ever on a system that's leaking terribly and going really wrong. The sort of modern idea of science and technology saving us every time from itself, and then sticking on these huge problematic techno fixes. Whereas if we look back at the history of technology, as Benjamin Breton says nicely, no seatbelts without a car, right? And no car accidents without a car. So every technology makes its own accidents and makes its own problems. But even though we're in the biggest problem of them all with the climate crisis, still the lesson doesn't seem to sink in with people that there is not this enclosed space that is completely knowable and therefore predictable and therefore manageable. And so any technology we will make and that promises finally to close the gaps and to create the totality will always create its own further problems. And I think geoengineering is maybe like, now we are going for planetary scale problem solving with technology, because we have reached planetary scale problems of technology, right? First, we developed a technosphere industry on a planetary scale that's now really wrecking the planet basically on every metric you can imagine. So then the response is, well, let's double down and make planetary technologies to solve those problems. But yeah, one wonders when the realization will sink in that there's an intrinsic problem with this way of thinking. Yeah, and that's something that you can approach on different levels with your practice. So I try with the activism. I think it's really interesting to talk about the emotional dimension, and with more philosophy and theory, you can talk more about the scientific heritage, what's beneath the politics and the economics, basically. What kind of basic assumptions about how we can know the world and the world works allow us to make this mistake again and again and again.
Right. A few weeks ago, I thought, well, actually, we're always speaking about that our technology is so advanced. But I don't really think it's so advanced because it's driving climate change. So, and climate change is like threatening us. So I don't think it's like a car that doesn't have seat belts and everything like that, and a brake and all that, and the emissions from the car go right into the window where the people are sitting. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
But so our technology is based on taking energy out of something which is put in, for instance, in the ground through a natural process, or natural, let's avoid that word, but a process which in the history of the planet is used to stabilize. So have a stability between the CO2 and other kind of gases that are in the sky, in the environment, and the ones that are in the earth. And it's taking those out of the earth and then putting them in the sky. So if we take humans out of the equation, it's like putting a fume pipe into the earth and interfering with something that's happening in the earth.
Yeah.
Okay, I just said I want to make it very simple, but it's like basically the simplest thing is that our technology that has brought us so much good, that you're in a different part of the country than me. We're able to speak to each other and record this and put it out there, which is great, I think. But it's also causing the topic that we're speaking about.
Yeah, and then of course, like it's not a choice between Zoom and climate change, but yeah, you could at some point wonder like how to weigh these different elements compared to each other, right? Like how to value Zoom versus climate change and their relations. It's of course super complex story, but it also goes to the question of I liked this term timefulness that you brought in, and that uh, the climate crisis is on such a huge time scale. We usually don't think beyond 2100, but it's of course like thousands of years into the future that we are now determining these planetary processes with humanity, with certain humans. The power is not with all of us, of course, in equal measure, but it's such a big scale of time to think about. And then also to have moral thoughts about. So I also think that's a challenge we face now to together to develop the language in all these conversations we're having about these big scales, but then also to create like a moral sensibility to that, which we don't have, especially in Western cultures. We don't have an intergenerational way of thinking about morality. We don't think about what we inherit from our ancestors as something that's alive in us and something that we have to respond to or have a responsibility to, let alone thinking generations ahead to how our actions as ancestors affect others. And happily some authors have now brought this into the conversation, like Roman Kresnik, right, with his Good Ancestor book, and this intergenerational thinking. But that's of course is also ecological thinking to my mind. Ecology is all about, like generating, growing, but also about the way that generations fit together. Like a forest also moves, but it moves intergenerationally. It doesn't move per individual tree. And we are so stuck in this individualistic framework. It's really hard for us to talk about and think about climate change because we just don't have that scope of thinking or feeling in ways that are with others, that are moral in that sense.
But that's the part that I don't get, because it's not. I mean, for me, it's very concrete. If we just had the climate conference in Egypt, where nothing really happened that should happen. And those are people in power. They can actually do something. If they come together and say we agree on this, they do it. They can do it. But they didn't do it, and this affects, and many of them have children and grandchildren. And if you have a child right now that's under 20 or under 10 years old, they will live in a completely different world. And that's the part I don't get, because I get, there's the horizons of the tragedy of the horizons, that it's very hard. We can prevent suffering in the future, but because it's too abstract for us, we don't do it, and we focus on the suffering now, like farmer protests or shrinking economy or having to change, not go on holiday with the airplane. But the part I don't get, maybe you can explain to me, is that the people that can do something about it, they have children and grandchildren, and what they're doing is kind of destroying the future of their own children and their own grandchildren.
Yeah. I mean, that's a big question, of course. I can try to at least carry forward some threads of this conversation. Some people call it a crisis of the imagination also, for example, right? That we cannot imagine these futures. So emotionally connecting to the science is in itself a problem, but maybe in between that, you have to be able to translate graphs and squiggly lines and long tables of numbers and statistical probabilities and scenarios into a living world, into an idea of a world that you are in. So that fourth wall again of is it just a TV show that you're watching, or is it something that you're inhabiting, that you have an active living relationship to?
So in that sense, it's really in Plato's cave. If you think it's just on the screens, it's not really happening. It's like a reverse Plato's cave.
Yeah, because you're so used to being in the ideas thing, which is actually not real. that
Yeah.
you don't, yeah, and the cave is who cares about the effing cave, right? The cave is just some shadows on a wall, whereas, yeah, it's actually your house. So I think that it's also about when you talk about intergenerational morality or relationships, the quality of the relationship is, I think, the question. So, like, how do you relate to your grandchild's future and to the and to that future being in a living world with all these other living entities? And if you look, I'm working now a lot also with First Nation and in particular Aboriginal knowledge systems to understand how, like, what's before Plato is also outside of us as moderns in the West, but it's still all these cultures are okay. Most of them have been really done a lot of violence too, but a lot of them are still living cultures. And there you see that these kinship systems are incredibly important, not as quaint, archaic beliefs that are wrong according to all these men of science of Europe, but that it's a different quality of experience that they provide, which provides a different types of technologies, different ways of surviving and living together that are relational, but that also really give you different agency in the world, that really give you a different sense of what you should and can do. So if we think about all these leaders sitting there in an Egyptian resort town sponsored by Coca-Cola trying to solve the world's problems, given that they have kids and they're probably not evil, they probably don't see themselves as evil people. They probably have positive motivations for doing what they do. They probably have a positive story about their life. I wonder where their relationships with the world begin and end. And, like Plato came from the Greek time, and then oikos, the household, was kind of invented as this enclosed space where you had certain responsibilities and certain rules came from that, how to manage that closed space. And there was a very small oikos. You had the polis, a small city-state, and then you had your household and your slaves and your family that you were responsible to manage well.
So that's where the word economy comes from, right? From oikos.
Yeah, oikos,
how to manage your house. Yeah,
how to manage your house. And
ecology as well.
Yeah, so
that's interesting.
Ecology also has a dubious history in that sense.
Yeah.
But then the question is always, and this is for me the environmental question, what is your house? And how do you relate to everything in your house? And then, of course, patriarchally, we can say, this is my house, and it's like I have my family in there, but the planet can also be your house, or maybe somewhere in between. So the Aboriginal people say, country, and that's a really specific word that indicates like all the living relationships, but also the mythological and the narrative and all the meanings, also the ways the birds, the languages birds have amongst each other. That's all part of country as this emergent whole that you have responsibilities to, but also relationships with. So yeah, I think it's a poverty of world, a poverty of relationships, like this really shitty small oikos house in which you think you live and that you feel responsible for in a positive way, that you have a positive story about, like I'm doing well for my household, for my kids, maybe my family. This is just far too small. I speak to a lot of people who are like, well, sometimes I speak to people who are sort of CEOs or something of big companies, and they'll be really, really try to be good parents, try to be good for the future of their kids. And that might even be the reason that they're like pocketing huge paychecks to secure the future of their family. So for their oikos and their relationships, they're taking care.
Oh, it's a really nice perspective. I never looked at it like that, but it's like, what do you see as your house, your ecology, your world, but also your economy? Where, of course, the argument of our own prime minister is, well, okay, we have to do something about the climate crisis. He said action, action, action in the previous, which is just very funny. But he's also saying, but it has to be affordable. And step by step, because we also have to keep the economy going. And it's not just like, I think there's also people who are only thinking about their family. Like, okay, it doesn't matter because my grandchildren can go on Elon Musk's spaceship to to Mars because they'll be so rich. But there are also like family businesses and everything that say, well, but we're providing jobs. We're taking care of the people in our business. And there we have so many employees. And we also have this whole country. We have the farmers. We have to make sure our country is doing well. So, yeah, they're saying, well, we are taking care of the future because we need the economy in the future. Yeah. And then people like you may be saying, yeah, but what if there's no planet anymore? Then where will you do all that stuff?
Yeah, on your asteroid village. Yeah. And so, yeah, so this, I find this really fascinating, that a simple question like what is the environment, if you pose it to Plato, you suddenly get a very different understanding of why he proposed his way of thinking. And we don't need to take that in the same way that he said it, because actually his story is only half of the story, because the other half of the story is the world he was living in and talking to and with and from. But we miss out on that, right? So we only see Plato's story and we think, wow, that's a great story. And maybe like Mark Rutte, a lot of people who are proud entrepreneurs, they also only just hear the story that he talks about and think like, okay, so that's the story, that's all we need to know. We have our total full understanding because
if people have work and they have sufficient money, they can take off their basic needs, then they'll be happy and they can make free choices. I mean, it's a good story, right?
Makes sense to me. Yeah. And it's a full story, so there's nothing left out. Seemingly, or it's not a story that says this is a partial story. It's a story that says this is all we need to know. And that's of course a danger where, you know, like the middle of the road right wing and the far right have a really good conversation with each other about this enclosed space of Netherlands or of the economy and jobs that we have a right to naturally because we live here, because we are hardworking Dutch people or hardworking people from a certain group. So we don't have to think beyond our borders, and we certainly are not going to listen to people from other positions speaking from other oikos and understand that they also have a place to be. It's not really interesting to us. So I think it's always really fascinating to just keep on asking, just pulling at the sweater thread, asking, but what is the environment? What is your environment? What is the broader story that you're speaking from? And you can, of course, ask that question endlessly and end up somewhere far in the edges of the galaxy, you know, talking about stars and gravity and all kinds of things, but you can also end up at really personal, emotional stories about people's histories and maybe what their grandparents told them, or in other cultures, what their ancestors tell them still from you know, the stars or from the sea, or how they conceive of these relationships. So yeah, and to me, the climate crisis is just this avalanche. It's a literal avalanche, but it's also an avalanche of evidence that however we try to close our story, there's always something else coming in. For the far right people, it's migration often, right? It's like everything would be fine if not for all these damned foreigners coming into our country and messing up our economy and our household. But I think the real one is, yeah, that there is no away, as Timothy Morton says. So as long as you keep thinking you're pushing things away or throwing things out, they're still there. So all these walls that we try to build are in the end still relationships, but they're just they become relationships of violence instead of being able to be relationships, you know, that you can be non-violent with. And this is really the double problem that we're facing now. On the one hand, that this thinking that there's an outside that we can put all our trash in and all the negative consequences of our technologies and our economies is simply is boiling over, is coming back to haunt us in the biggest way possible. But also the idea of people who are not like us or people who have different opinions from us, we don't have to talk to them. We don't want to know what they're saying. They just have to leave. These two things are coming up together now, you know, like populism, fascism is really becoming on the radar for lots of people again. I think the debate about, can we call it fascism, has been sort of finished in the sense of, okay, we can talk about this phenomenon being back, coming up again. At the same time that the pressures from the environment are coming back. So the outside is, and the relationship to what we think is outside of our house is becoming a really emotional, psychological, and rational challenge now.
So that's the diagnosis. Do you also have a solution? Where do you, because you're an activist and you're also an academic, you also publish sometimes opinion pieces in newspapers? At least that's what I've just been following you for a few weeks, so that's what I've been seeing. There's probably loads of other things you do as well. So it's kind of like journalism, being there in the media, being, on blocking the freeway with Hannah and others. And
yeah.
But you also work for an academic institution. So how do you see that balance? How do you combine how do you find your way in all this?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, let's say there's a really personal motivation to do it like this, and that's again about this timefulness, that the activism is really of the now, and it's really, even the demands of Extinction Rebellion are like that. You have to stop all the fossil subsidies now, not tomorrow, not in a negotiated settlement ending in 15 years with lots of loopholes. A really clear way of inhabiting the now according to what you think is necessary. So on a personal level,
well, what you think is necessary, that's what the scientists say we have to do.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, backed up by the largest possible scientific consensus. But the act of doing it is a willful act. It's a moral act also. It's also in that sense you're not in the house, but you're in the society, in the polis, saying something you think everybody should respond to. That is a question that we all should be talking about. So it's very acute, and that has a certain energy and also a certain emotional role that we also started with, this existential sense of, wow, all the science is saying something. So getting onto the street is a way to really respond to that and make it real, and make also your inner life connect to what you know about the world by doing something. So once I sit on the street and I come home, the universe is balanced again for a little while, even though all the news is still happening and all the 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, 4 degrees kinds of traumatic information flow continues. Everything is in balance for a little while. And then the academic work, from the personal perspective, is far more long term. So it's far more stretched out. I mean, before you get the article published can be 1.5 years. And like when you start planning an action, maybe 6 weeks later the action happens. So there's very different timefulness to that work, but also you're talking to a different group of people. So we were talking about having relationships to your ancestors like they're real people. I mean, I think academics also have a relationship to other academics that's not only like, hey, Mario, we're talking now on Zoom, but also you're talking to people, I mean, depending maybe also on your ambitions and what kind of writing you're doing, but you're always talking to people also in 5 years or something, or maybe 10 years or even longer. So
especially when it's you write a tweet or do something which is on the internet.
Exactly. So, and I find that very comforting. It would be a bit traumatic for me to only be in the now and only be doing the activism, because it's so short and so acute.
Yeah.
That there's very little space in that to stretch out a little into time and also to relate to the future in different ways. So for me, the academic work, so it's on ecological governance. This is, let's say, my proposition. And I see that as a question for 2040, and not to be super arrogant about it. And maybe also everything is messed up so much by then, that we don't have access to journals anymore. But in my mental space, that work stretches to 2040. So it has a very different temporality, but also a very different world it responds to. because of course in 2040 the world is going to be far more chaotic than it is now.
Something just clicked for me there when I recognized something of myself in that. I was listening to another podcast. Okay, this is more for the Dutch people, but a podcast by Theo Maassen, who's a Dutch comedian. And he's doing a podcast which is called Ervaring for Beginners, which is really, really good. Experience for novices. So he's speaking with experienced artists and comedians and makers and everybody about that. And he was speaking with Paul de Leeuw, who is now, I think, in his 60s or something.
Mm-hmm.
And he was asking how, if you sing a sentimental song, he made some songs that really touch people, like people request him at funerals to sing that song. How do you make sure that you don't get overwhelmed by the emotions? And his answer was, he heard it from a mentor of his again. His answer was that when you're reading that, you have to read 2 lines ahead. So you're singing the lyrics that if you really would connect with them, you would just start crying, which is not good if you're singing. But instead you focus as well on, you're already actually 2 lines ahead, you're already in the future. And I just connected this to kind of my own way of dealing with the anger about the inaction, about people who are aware of the science, which is pretty much everyone, and who are yet choosing not to do anything with anyway, that anger.
Yeah.
By also knowing that when sometimes I'm speaking with someone and I know they're not going to get it. I know they're sometimes a person who went to university, who are actually in a scientific profession, but the things that they're saying are just science denial, about the climate crisis.
Yeah.
So then sometimes my way of dealing with the anger is to say something, not to them now, but to them maybe in 2 years or something, or to them when the next warmest day of the year comes, or the next flood or something like that.
Yeah.
So it's, I don't know, does that make sense to you? So it's like part of, from philosophy, like for instance, Heidegger, we don't live just in the present, we're extended. We also live in the future. Maybe we even primarily live in the future.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like, you had the the ecological footprint that BP, British Petroleum, some time ago, like proposed, like we have to all manage our own ecological footprint.
Yeah.
So that, that's a really small time space to live in, basically, because very much a spreadsheet in the now, and I have to do my plastic, and I have to not, use too much gas and stuff. And then somebody else came up with the climate shadow, which was this idea that your behavior influences others, both, let's say, as a consumer, but especially also as a citizen or a friend or a colleague. And that actually has much more impact as a social being than purely as a consuming entity. So already there you see that your extension in time and space becomes already a bit larger, but you have to kind of get it, right? You have to understand, like, I'm influencing my friends maybe in a positive way, or we are making more plants in our garden now here in Zaandam, and then you see the neighbors at a certain point also putting some more flowers in their garden. So there's all these ways in which you can influence your surroundings, but you do have to look at it from that perspective, and that's something you have to kind of learn and experience. So when you look at Extinction Rebellion, what I love about that is that you there also learn experientially, like, so if we do this together, and it's not about kind of claiming like a heroic leadership role or anything, it's about doing it together and supporting each other in it. Like the leading person is the group. And with that, we can actually really do the stuff that we usually feel so helpless and powerless against, because we gather and we come together and we grow. It's this also old sort of socialist feeling maybe of time space, but now without the modernistic ideology. So yeah, I try to think of it in those terms, and then again this idea of relationality, also to like indigenous cultures that they also have this different time space because they have these cultural technologies, if you want to call them that, these emotional repositories, these books of how to live together, that manage to bring in all this time and all this space into something that you can feel and understand. So it's not only a rational thought, but it's also something you can live in. And then from that sense, and so that's also kind of like building your house out to make it bigger, to make the oikos bigger and bring more things into it. And then you come to the point of, for me, the point of agency, of this idea of like, what am I able to do, is always also a question of what do I think is the environment I'm in, or how do I see my house? And it's something that you can do together. So, if you think you are in a tiny consumerist house with a lot of apps and a big bank account, yeah, then your agency is also limited to those things. And then you have your ecological footprint or your climate footprint. If you see yourself as a social being with friends and relationships, okay, then your agency is suddenly maybe also to be part of these different trends and these different ideas that can be shared and can spread. And then if you're a part of a movement, wow, that's a big time space. But if you're a part of a tradition that goes back 7 generations and forward 7 generations, I can only imagine how that really feels, because you have to practice that culturally with your surroundings to be able to do it. But imagine what kind of spread out big world you're living in, then how much agency you also have in the world. It's quite spectacular. And then the modern men of science would laugh maybe at that and say like, yeah, no, but these are like pre-moderns. These are people that don't understand science, don't understand the way things work. What kind of technologies do they have? They can't even Zoom with each other by distance and make a great podcast about it. But well, what are we missing from what they are experiencing?
Yeah.
What do we not see?
Yeah, I was again just an association, but it's quite ironic that the climate conference was in Egypt, who were able to build the pyramids that we couldn't build today. Even if we would figure out we would have the tools that they have, we couldn't build them. I just saw this program with Ruud Gullit. I just realized the Dutch football just started in Qatar, which is a whole other story. Just kind of mixing some things together. But I think, so this is, I don't know if this is an indigenous culture, I don't think so, but it's at least an ancient civilization that was able to do something that we cannot dispute, because tourists can go there every year, and it's perfectly lined, like it's straight. The pyramid is really big, it's very straight, and there's only just a few millimeters margin of error, which is, even with modern tools, is really, really hard to do, and they were able to do it. The thing that fascinates me is that apparently they knew something that we don't. And so I guess that was my association, kind of a humility. Okay, we know many things. We can Zoom, but we cannot build the pyramid.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that maybe that's also to just keep kind of telescoping back and forth back to Plato's time, and then to climate change, and to the Egyptians, that what happens when there's the cave and the ideas, what happens when there's the world and the science and the laws, is also that Plato knows the horse, the idea of the horse. He's been up there out of the cave. So like whatever anybody else says about the horse, they can go, figure it out for themselves, because Plato has the truth. And there's only one truth. Even also in modern science, you have all these people like Isabella Stengers and stuff talking about this, like where there's this idea that our way of looking at the world is the better one, because it's the progressive one, because it's the next step in history, and it doesn't replace things that were different but that were smaller and less, and now it's more and better. And there's this, okay, it's super arrogant and a bit silly, but it creates such a huge blind spot, because you can only replace things with what's somehow better, so there's no space for different things to exist next to each other which are different. And it's such a simple thing to say, like, oh, wait, you can look at the world in different ways. There are different ways of understanding technology, and we are not always on the pinnacle of history and humanity and the world as white guys talking together on Zoom, but it's just different. And it's really hard for people to deal with that basic idea, which is a very non-violent idea, to say, like, like, I'm not going to colonize you, or I'm not going to claim that I know everything and that my thing is always the best. And then also be afraid of the next person coming along always that will say, like, haha, you were wrong, I have an even better idea. And then you get sort of erased and the next person wins. It's also this really zero-sum competitive idea of how you can explain the world and be in the world. That is both really scientific, but also really emotional, and also makes for this really destructive habit of it being weird that the Egyptians would be able to do something, the ancient Egyptians, that we cannot. Whereas there's so many things we probably cannot do that other people could do, but we just kind of erase that from memory, or try to erase it at least.
Yeah, and they also had their own versions of cave allegories, but that's for another time. I just I was thinking about how we started. You were speaking about a phenomenon about, let's say, a group of people that share something, but they don't realize they share it. Like we can say people in a modern city often feel lonely, and chances are that their neighbor is lonely as well. But they don't realize that the other person is lonely, so they don't drink tea together, which, would make them very happy. Yeah, that's just my own thinking now about the cave, is when the prisoner returns, he wants to share something with the people who are still there, but they try to kill him. His message does not come across well. It's easy to think of Socrates in this sense as like an activist who's trying to come wake up people. I mean, the world is ending, but actually he has a very positive message. But the thing about it is that maybe what this person is trying to share is not so much going physically outside of something and seeing something and going back, but maybe it's, let's say, a subjective experience, what we would call a subjective experience. Like maybe finding out about climate science and just thinking, what the fuck is going on, and getting very angry and upset about it, and then trying to talk about it with your family or with your coworkers or whatever, and they don't connect. And
but this is, of course, like, it connects for me to two things. On the one hand, this idea of, like, we had this perfect household and everything was fine.
Yeah,
and we were having fun. And then something from outside came in, which we thought wasn't there. And now we're really pissed off at the person who showed us that the wall is a relationship, and that there's actually all these, like, foreign agents, from bacteria to people with other skin colors, that might suddenly, like, disrupt our safe space. So in that sense, maybe Plato had some, there was some sense to Plato's allegory in terms of, like, how environments and humans interact. But especially also what I like about this heritage from Plato and Socrates is this idea of the Parrhesiast, the truth speaker. I think that's also really relevant to activism now, where, like, the first demand of Extinction Rebellion is tell the truth. And then, of course, that could be like, tell the person up in the sky with the mathematical ideas saw, and bring it back to the silly people in the cave. But I like the Dutch translation, which is wees eerlijk, which is more like be honest than tell the truth. So it's less about having a thing that other people don't have, and it's more about, as you said, a subjective experience, or like bringing something existential into a conversation, which doesn't need to exclude other things. But that, according to, like, Michel Foucault, this famous French philosopher, did a whole series of lectures about this ancient Greek idea of parousia, which is then truth-telling, truth-speaking. and that you can only do it if there's a risk, if you put yourself at risk to your community. So if this truth is uncomfortable to the community, and speaking the truth means that you might not be accepted anymore by your community. There was a specific word for that in Greek, and Socrates was like the ultimate, so somehow example of that. And then he drank the cup of poison as the consummation of his truth-telling practice. But that is something that is very recognizable in this age, that it is a truth in the sense that the way we are in the world, the way that the dynamics around us in the world behave, we know with enough certainty that the CO2 molecule causes heating, and we like, science is a construction, but facts are made, but they're not made up, as Donna Haraway says. So this is not a made up truth. They are made truths, but they work, and we know the consequences thereof. But bringing them into society that is still in the house or behind the fourth wall watching the television show of the climate change, if you tell them like, no, you're really in it and we're fucked, as Extinction Rebellion said with their banner, then people get pissed off. You break a societal code somehow, or an agreement that we're fine and that it's okay and we don't have to be afraid.
Which also sounds a part of trauma, right? No, everything's fine.
Yeah, yeah. But it also shows something, about what's the role of activists that maybe we don't talk about so much, because truth is like immediately suspect and too much. It's arrogant or over the top. But then, bringing something into society which is so fundamental and so strong causes all these responses. And actually, of course, a healthy society would be able to, on the one hand, judge, like, is this sensible what they're saying? What journalists now, of course, for example, respond a lot is like, you have activists that talk about climate change, you have activists that talk about farmers or farming. But they're basically, everybody has a voice.
That talk about evil reptilians ruling the world.
Yeah, and everybody has a voice, so who are we to judge or to check what's happening? We have to give everybody a platform as part of the societal body. But that really discounts this idea of paresia and this idea of like, what are people doing? How are they? From where is information being brought, and what is the cost for them to bring it? And in that sense, I was having a conversation yesterday with people also from media that I said, like, I do not understand why activists, especially climate activists, are not a normal part of societal debates. Why don't they have columns in newspapers? Why aren't they at every talk show table? Because, like, by now we know that the truth that they're telling is a scientific truth, is real, and that they are always non-violent. So they're really a dependable group in that sense. That's really clear what their societal role should be, but still they're really pushed out of the narrative always and not seen as a legitimate actor, but like really as a fringe actor. So I wonder about that. I wonder about all the gatekeepers and all the people managing the talk shows and newspapers. Like, is that again that emotional resistance that we started talking about?
Well, we had someone literally gluing himself to a talk show table recently in the Netherlands.
Yeah, and you did see, right, that something happens there then, to also for a moment, at least to the talk show hosts, that something opens in their perspective. They invite some climate scientists, they listen, they're concerned.
And why was he invited? He was invited to speak not about climate, but about the form of throwing soup at paintings.
Yeah.
Not about why they were doing it, but about whether this is the right form to do whatever they want to do. So
exactly.
Then they invited him to a talk show and include himself to the table. And then the next day, or I don't know, the day afterward, they invited Hannah and a climate scientist to his talk show table. I don't think I think they stopped doing it now.
Yeah, probably. We'll see in the coming weeks. I mean, yesterday the COP ended, so there was still some
It was
news that
still
they had to
sexy in the
bring.
media, yeah.
I think there's two ways the media work. Either they feel like, yeah, we just can't skip this; it's just too obviously important, or is it sexy? Um, or a mix of the two. And yesterday, the end of the COP, they had I think, a good item on the Dutch news that explained it well, and that also asked the climate minister, but if this is really what you're saying, aren't we going to miss the 1.5 degrees? And the interviewer was a bit distraught about this. You felt there was a bit of emotion in the question or underneath the question. And of course, the minister for climate and economy said, like, he talked over it. He explained what we are doing and that there are certain things happening, etc. And then the person repeated, but the interviewer, the journalist repeated, but above 1.5 degrees, isn't that really catastrophic consequences for society? And then the minister again talked over it, but that question was really, I think, in that sense, strong. But that's, of course, a question that should be asked every day. But you feel with the interviewer in that situation, the heaviness of what happens, because you get into this existential state, like, wait a minute, what's happening here, really?
Yeah.
And
And even catastrophic is, I mean, people are numb to it right now.
yeah, but there's this moment of parrhesia almost.
Yeah. What will happen? Okay. So, you are saying that the consent that we will get to 1.5 degrees, and what will happen when we get to 1.5 degrees? What will the world look like? And that's the question, right? That's what the interviewer tries to do. What will
Well,
happen?
the interviewer tried to ask the minister for climate in the Netherlands, like, but what you're telling me now basically is we're not going to make the 1.5 degrees. And if you're telling me this, then we know that that has really catastrophic consequences. Trying to just grasp the reality of the facts on TV with the minister being a politician, not responding in a Parisiastic way, not being honest, even though that would risk a lot of people getting scared, getting emotional responses, denying it, not voting for him again or his party, or whatever kind of dynamics you want to imagine. But you can see sometimes in the media when this honesty comes in that there's a certain risk that you feel happening because you go over a taboo edge of what we accept together to be real. And then they fall back into the safe space of maybe it's a television show after all, or let's just forget about this. So when you say, like, will they be invited back, us activists, to the talk show table?
So when the man stuck himself to the table, one of the first things the talk show host said is, "Do you think you will get invited back to talk shows like this?"
And it's funny, right? Because the reverse psychology thing happens every time. Like, oh no, activists think, oh no, we'll never get invited again, and other people think, haha, they'll never get invited again, and then they get invited again the next day. The guy who glued himself to the table was invited in Belgium to a talk show the next day, and then to a Dutch talk show the day after. And then before he was there, in the talk show, another activist was in another national talk show. Before those two people, only one activist had been in a talk show in the past 4 years at all. So it had been so silent. So what I think the question is to that's in the first place the journalists, but in the second place, let's say society as large, is like, do people manage to hold open that existential space, which is really scary and threatening, which your house is not closed, it's not safe, like we're in a precarious state. We don't know how the future will turn out. We don't know that our kids will be more wealthy, more healthy, better off than we are. To open up that space is a really emotional thing, also for journalists, also for politicians, but it's a societal challenge. So yeah, this idea of parrhesia, of speaking truth even if it risks your position in society, is really about opening that space, just to talk about the facts, but then also to process the facts, and that's more important, the emotional processing of the facts.
Well, thank you very much for speaking with me. think that's a nice place to end.
Yeah, well, a pleasure.
Let's speak another time again if you're willing. But we have to end somewhere. Thank you for listening. Go to livefromplatoscave.com for other episodes.